Hello Year 10, welcome to your first online religion lesson. It's Miss Andrews, I hope you're all doing well. Today we're going to be doing Christian Practices Lesson 1, where we're going to be looking at different forms of worship. Our aims are to understand different forms of worship and their significance, including congregational and private worship. Before we start, let's talk through a few rules for online religion lessons to make sure that you get the most out of these lessons and learn the maximum amount to stay on track for your predicted grade. Number 1, listen to all of the video. Number 2, complete all tasks on the same lined paper. Number 3, when you see this, you need to green pen your answers. Number 4, take a photo of your work and upload to Google Classroom by Sunday at 10 p.m. Let's start by having a look at some potential exam questions we might encounter at the end of this topic. Pause the video now, have a read through these questions so you know where we're headed. Let's talk now about what worship actually is. Worship means to offer God the praise he is due. Praise means admiration, respect, and appreciation. The word due means owed or deserved. So when Christians worship God, they show God the admiration and appreciation that they believe he deserves. Through worship, Christians show their love and thanks to God for all that they have. Remember, Christians believe that God has created them and created the world in which they live. They also believe that God sacrificed his Son to pay the penalty for human sin. They should thank God for this, and they do this through worship. Christians believe that worship is a two-way process in which both Christians and God communicate with each other. Now it's time for your first task. In a moment, you're going to pause the video and complete this task in full sentences on lined paper. Your first task is to write down what worship means. We're going to talk now about two different types of worship: congregational worship and private worship. Congregational worship is also called public worship. A congregation is a group of Christians meeting together for worship. So congregational worship, then, is when a group of Christians are worshipping together. Whereas private worship is when a person is worshipping alone. This could happen at church without other people there, at home, or in a public place. Private worship is often additional to congregational worship, meaning many Christians will do private worship as well as congregational worship. It's not one or the other. Let's look at some examples of public or congregational worship. Remember, congregational worship is worship that happens in a group. One example are Sunday church services, Bible study groups, and prayer groups. Now we're going to talk about the significance of public or congregational worship. When we say significance here, we mean, why is this type of worship important? What are the advantages or benefits that a Christian gets from this type of worship? One reason this type of worship is important is that it helps Christians to feel part of the Christian community who can encourage each other in their faith. For example, people who have recently become Christian can receive support and guidance from older Christians in their congregation. If a Christian didn't attend congregational worship, they might feel isolated and not like they were part of a community. The second reason congregational worship is significant is that it helps Christians to develop their relationship with God because they believe that God is present when they worship together. In the New Testament, Jesus promises that he is present in spirit when Christians meet together for worship. We'll have a look at a quotation about this together soon. The third reason this type of worship is significant is that they can develop their understanding of their faith by listening to the priest or minister's sermon. At a Sunday service, a leader in the church, such as the priest, will give a sermon. A sermon is a religious speech. Sermons are usually based around a passage from the Bible, and in them, the priest will share important Christian teachings with the congregation. This helps them to understand their faith better. The fourth reason congregational worship is significant is that they can take part in important rituals such as the Eucharist. Rituals are religious ceremonies which have special spiritual meaning. For example, during the Eucharist, Christians eat a small piece of bread and drink some wine to remember Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. We will learn more about the Eucharist later. Rituals are usually led by a priest and performed by the whole congregation together. So, if a Christian wants to take part in these rituals, they need to attend congregational worship. Now let's look at that quotation to support the importance of public or congregational worship. This quotation is from Matthew's Gospel in the New Testament. The quotation was said by Jesus to his followers. Jesus said, "For where 2 or 3 come together in my name, I am there with them." In this quotation, the 2 or 3 means a congregation. Come together in my name means to worship God. These 2 or 3 people are coming together in a group and their purpose is to worship God. When Jesus says, "I am there with them," he is promising that God will be present with the congregation during their worship. How would we explain this quotation for a pie paragraph? Well, we would write something like, this quotation teaches Christians that when they worship together, God is with them. Now it's time for your next task. In a moment, you're going to pause the video and you're going to answer the following review questions. Give yourself 10 minutes to do this. The first 2 are short answer questions. The third question is a 5-mark exam question. Now remember, in a 5-marker, you must include a quotation. Use the one from Matthew that we've just talked about. You must remember to use the structure: point, information, explain, point, development. Pause the video now and off you go. Now let's get those green pens ready to mark. Number 1. Congregational worship is when a group of Christians meet together for worship. For example, a Sunday church service. In this answer, make sure you've used the word group. Other examples you could have used are Bible study groups and prayer groups. Give yourself a tick if you've got this right, and correct it if you've missed anything. Number 2, congregational worship involves a group of Christians worshipping together, whereas private worship is someone worshipping alone. In this question, make sure you've got the contrast between an individual alone versus a group of Christians together. Again, give yourself a tick and add anything you have missed. Now let's move on to marking our 5-mark exam question. The first thing you need to do is to tick your point sentences. There are 4 possibilities here: feel part of the Christian community, develop their relationship with God, develop their understanding of their faith, and take part in important rituals. So you've got 2 point sentences, tick each one. Next, you need to tick your quotation. You should have used the quotation from Matthew's Gospel. You need to tick your explanation sentence where you explain what the quotation teaches Christians. And finally, tick the development sentence where you've developed your second point in more detail. Now you can give yourself a score out of 5 for this question. Now let's look at private worship in more detail. We're going to look at 2 examples of private worship. Remember, private worship is worship that a Christian does on their own. Example number 1 is reading the Bible. Christians may read passages from the Bible alone and reflect on them. Some Christians will read the Bible daily, others may read it less regularly. When they read the Bible, Christians will reflect on the meaning of the passage. Sometimes Christians may use Bible study notes to help them understand the passages better. Example number 2 is prayer. Some Christians pray every morning and evening, but Christians can pray any time during the day. They can pray using set prayers and informal prayers. We'll look at set prayers and informal prayers more in a future lesson, but for now, a set prayer is one where the words are already agreed and written out, whereas informal prayers are ones where the Christian comes up with the words themselves on the spot. Some Roman Catholics use a rosary to help them pray. A rosary is a string of beads with a crucifix attached to it. You can see a picture of one on the slide. Each bead represents a different set prayer. Catholics will hold the rosary and move their fingers around the different beads, praying as they go. Now let's look at the significance of private worship. Remember, the significance means why this type of worship is important. Reason number 1. Private worship helps Christians to develop a close and personal relationship with God. By connecting with God on their own, privately, without others, a Christian can strengthen their personal relationship with God. They can learn more about God by reading the Bible alone, and they can communicate with Him about their personal spiritual lives through prayer. Number 2. Private worship enables Christians to focus on their own spiritual needs without the distraction of others around them. By focusing on their own needs, this means maybe there's a particular part of the Bible or a part of their faith that a Christian wants to focus on, such as being more thankful to God. A Christian can focus on this during private worship in a way that might be difficult during congregational worship, where the individual has less control. For some Christians, private worship may be less distracting because there are no other people around to communicate with, so they can focus entirely on communicating with God. Now it's time for your next task. In a moment, pause the video and give yourself 10 minutes to answer the review questions below. In the first question, what is private worship? Make sure you give 2 examples of how a Christian might worship privately. Next, you've got 2 4-mark exam questions. Now remember, a 4-marker should follow the structure point, development, point, development. You don't need a quotation in this, but you do need a development sentence, which adds some extra detail to your point. Give yourself 10 minutes, off you go. Let's get your green pens ready and let's mark. So for question number 1, you should have private worship is when a Christian worships God alone. For example, they may read the Bible or pray. Make sure you've got those 2 examples. Now let's look at a 4 out of 4 model answer for the 4-mark question. Remember, we're following the structure point, development, point, development. One reason private worship is significant for Christians is that it helps Christians to develop a close and personal relationship with God. In this point sentence, notice how the question has been answered. They have given a reason why private worship is significant. Now let's read the development sentence. A Christian can learn about God by reading the Bible alone and reflecting on its meaning. Your development sentence must add further detail and examples to support your point sentence. Check your first point sentence and development sentence now. Have you answered the question? Have you added further detail in your development? Let's carry on reading. Another reason private worship is significant for Christians is that it allows them to focus on their own spiritual needs without the distraction of others around them. Some Christians may find that when they are surrounded by other people, they think more about communicating with people than with God. Again, when you're checking your second point and development sentence, make sure your point sentence answers the question, and make sure your development sentence adds some extra detail, maybe using an example. Give yourself a score out of 4 for your exam question. Now we're going to read a model answer for the second 4 marker. One form of Christian worship is congregational worship. In this form of worship, Christians worship together in a group, such as at a Sunday service. Another form of Christian worship is private worship. In this form of worship, a Christian worships God alone, such as by reading the Bible and reflecting on its meaning. Again, you can see here the structure point, development, point, development. Make sure that your point sentences answer the question, they describe a form of worship. Make sure your development sentences add more detail, they describe more. What is this type of worship? And they give some examples to make it clear to your examiner that you know exactly what you are writing about. And that's the end of this first online Christian practices lesson. Next lesson, we're going to look at liturgical, non-liturgical, and informal worship. Bye-bye.